Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à ce webinaire qui est organisé à l'occasion de la Journée mondiale sans tabac de l'OMS, dont le thème cette année est Grow Food, Not Tobacco. Et donc, c'est la problématique et la culture du tabac. Et nous avons avec nous d'abord, j'aimerais simplement me présenter. Je suis Pascal Itelme, vice-président du CNCT et un ancien fonctionnaire de l'OMS où j'ai passé la quasi-totalité de ma carrière. Nous avons avec nous 4 éminents panélistes. Nous avons Leslie Ray-Ferrat, Brenda Chitindi, Inoussa Sauna et Dorcas Kiptui. Et notre première présentation sera faite par Leslie Ray-Ferrat sur le thème Tobacco, an obstacle to SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, avec le mot d'ordre Grow Food, Not Tobacco. Leslie, je vais la présenter brièvement en anglais, because the acronyms are too complicated in French. Leslie is the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Tobacco Control, which formerly was the Framework Convention Alliance for Tobacco Control, FCA, and President-elect of the NCD Alliance, Non-Communicable Disease Alliance. So, Leslie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pascal, and thank you to our colleagues for organizing the webinar today on this really important theme. I believe that our colleagues from ATCAR are going to share my screen today, so I'll just give them 1 second to bring up the slides. Great. So as Pascal mentioned, I will be presenting on the theme, Let's Grow Food, Not Tobacco. As we all know, that tobacco is an obstacle to the SDG. Next slide. I'll be touching on 3 things today. I've been asked to give a bit of an overview of the topic, as we'll all be hearing after from my fellow panelists here, some case studies and examples in their own countries. So I will start with the impact of tobacco growing on the Sustainable Development Goals, focusing mainly on Sustainable Development Goal number 2, number 3, number 4, number 8, and number 15, as there is quite an impact on multiple of the goals. We'll look at some of the barriers to Article 17 implementation of the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, and then I'll just follow up at the end with a few conclusions. So as I said, the impact of tobacco growing on the SDGs is quite large, as it spreads across multiple SDGs, notably 2, 3, 4, 8, and 15. We'll start with SDG 2. So if we could move to the next slide, please, which is just a picture of SDG 2, which looks at end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Next slide, please. So tobacco has a growing impact, especially on food security and nutrition. And there's multiple different angles where we can see that tobacco has a growing impact across SDG 2, notably in the scarcity of quality land. So quality of land is increasingly used for tobacco growing, which then reduces the amount of quality land that we have to nourish food crops. It also is a limited choice. It provides a limited choice of alternatives. Other alternative crops are often limited due to the absence of strong assured markets compared to the tobacco markets. The tobacco industry has been known to make tobacco farming accessible by providing an established supply chain, loaning inputs, fertilizers, for example, to farmers, and also promising this kind of guaranteed market to the farmers by committing to purchase the tobacco leaves that the farmers produce. which gives them quite an incentive then to continue to produce tobacco. And then they provide these arrangements that provide credits, inputs, and guaranteed markets, which are seldom present or not present with alternative crops in low and middle income countries, making the lack of economic alternatives one of the various reasons why farmers continue to produce tobacco. It also has the degrading of soil. So excessive chemicals used to produce tobacco plant degraded soil and nutrients for actual productive farming of other alternatives. And the crop intensity. So the tobacco crop is labor intensive, taking up to 9 months to mature. And this makes it very difficult for farmers to grow other food crops within the same year, contributing to this big chain of food insecurity. Next slide, please. And as I said, I'm running through these because I think a lot of the other presenters will touch on them more. So now looking at Sustainable Development Goal number 3 and how tobacco farming impacts the lives and well-being of all of us. Next slide, please. So the impact on health. There's multiple impacts on health. The first one being kind of the tobacco green sickness, where tobacco production causes nicotine poisoning or green tobacco sickness in tobacco farmers, which is caused by skin and respiratory exposure to dissolved nicotine from the tobacco leaves themselves, which also women and children who often work on tobacco farms run the risk of also being impacted by this tobacco green sickness. Farmers face heavy exposure to chemicals and nicotine. They're exposed daily to tobacco dust and other chemical pesticides. And a tobacco farmer who plants, cultivates, and harvests tobacco may absorb nicotine equivalent to 50 cigarettes per day, also causing chronic lung condition. Tobacco farmers who inhale large amounts of tobacco and smoke during the curing process increases the risk of chronic lung conditions and other health challenges. And then the barrier to tobacco control and NCD prevention. Tobacco leaf farming produces a health harming product and interferes with both national and global tobacco control and NCD prevention, which then limits, it hinders the prevention and provides a lot of limitations to actually implementing these measures. Next slide. Sustainable Development Goal 4 and 8. So we're looking at quality education and decent work and economic growth. The impact of growing tobacco on education, decent work, and economic growth may not be kind of quite apparent when we're looking at the other two in terms of health and food security, but these are still also important ones to highlight. There's very kind of exploitative work practices that leaves farmers in debt and child labor in tobacco farms. And children then who are kind of forced to work in the tobacco farms, it often limits the opportunities for quality education for children when they're stuck working on these tobacco farms, which then impedes education. There's minimal contribution to livelihoods and GDP. Tobacco production has been shown to contribute very minimally actually to GDP, despite what the industry likes to say, and farmers' overall livelihoods. So it's really not as helpful to economic development as the industry likes to actually suggest. And studies that quantify tobacco farmer earnings found that despite the comparatively high per kilogram price of tobacco leaf, once labor costs are actually incorporated, most of the tobacco farmers actually operate at a very small margin or at a loss. And often their households are amongst the poorest in their countries. Farmers get very little money considering all the efforts that they put in, knowing that tobacco leaf production is very labor intensive. And it is also systematically undegraded, leaving tobacco farmers with very, very little room for negotiation, which then puts them to my third point in debt. As growing tobacco requires access to multiple supplies and services, such as seed and fertilizer at the very start of the season. And the tobacco industry often advances these costs, but then those are deducted from their payments at the end of the season. So if they're not able to make as much money, they find themselves in debt as they're kind of having to pay back the tobacco industry at the end of each season. And in terms of income generation, some alternative crops have actually been shown to generate more income for tobacco for farmers than tobacco. So several studies have indicated that alternative crops actually generate more income, but the tobacco industry has been known to make tobacco farming really accessible by providing an established supply chain, loaning inputs, like I mentioned, and promising that guaranteed market. So, from an income generation perspective, the tobacco industry has these kind of arguments that they put forward of how great it is to do tobacco farming. But in the end, there actually also are some alternative crops that have been shown to actually generate more income. And lastly, on Sustainable Development Goal 15, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, et cetera, et cetera. So we're looking at the environment here and all of the different ways that tobacco has impacts on the environment. The three big ones that I'll speak about today are deforestation. So tobacco farming accounts for about 5% of total deforestation, further contributing to CO2 emissions and climate change. And it approximately takes one tree to make 300 cigarettes. And as my colleague and I were putting this presentation together, some of these statistics actually baffled me, that one tree, one whole tree for 300 cigarettes, which leads to massive deforestation and hunger. And there's limited fertile land to grow tobacco now in some of these regions. The extremely heavy use of pesticides. Tobacco farming requires very heavy use of pesticides and fertilizers, which contributes to soil degradation. And the harsh use of these pesticides depletes soil fertility, which lowers soil fertility to produce alternative crops. And these chemicals also escape into the aquatic environment, contaminating lakes, rivers, and drinking water. And lastly, the loss of biodiversity. Tobacco farming contributes to the fragmentation of the habitat, causing loss of biodiversity. The last point before I move to the conclusions is looking at the different barriers to Article 17 implementation. So as we talked about the kind of economic impact of tobacco farming, tobacco farming is trapping these farmers in a cycle of debt. And the industry just keeps these farmers dependent by providing them with incentives such as loans or supplies needed to grow tobacco, like seeds and agrochemicals. Lack of access to markets for alternative crops, as I mentioned. So market access to absorb alternative crops, including for food surplus, is still limited in many low and middle income country contexts. And the lack of credit. Farmers in rural contexts tend to lack access to credit, and tobacco companies are unable to entrap these farmers in this cycle of debt and poverty due to this lack of access of rural credit that is available, but that the industry tends to tell them that it's not available. Just a couple concluding remarks. In terms of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, it calls for the implementation of both demand and supply side reduction for comprehensive tobacco control. And exploring the cultivation of alternative food crops is an extremely important opportunity to fully implement Article 17 of the treaty. And the cultivation of food crops provides the opportunity to improve policy coherence between the Sustainable Development Goal 3.A and all of the other SDGs that I spoke about today, all while strengthening tobacco control. Agricultural programs established in partnership with government, the UN, and civil society that do not include tobacco production and focus on alternative food crops present an enormous opportunity to explore alternative crops while engaging in national and global commitments to SDG 2, which is zero hunger. And these opportunities have the potential to improve the lives of farming communities and align national and global health priorities around this supply side reduction measures for comprehensive tobacco control and NCD prevention. I will stop there. I gave a very quick overview in about 10 minutes. I think I stuck to my time. And I'm really excited now to hear from our other colleagues that Pascal will be introducing to give us some really great country examples. So thank you, Pascal, over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. This was a fascinating expose of all the damage the tobacco growing is doing. And in fact, it's even surprisingly large. Very few suspect the extent of the damage. I don't know if we have time for a question. There is one question that I could ask you. You know, you have shown us all these problems. What is the extent of the tobacco industry's responsibility in those problems, which basically have been with us for not just recently, but decades?
Thanks, Pascal. I think biggest, and I touched on it very briefly in the presentation, but I think the biggest kind of blockage and responsibility is the messaging coming from the industry. You know, the messages coming out that this is such a, you know, a high investment product to be producing. The return on investment, there's no other crops that you can do that would get this much money back into your pocket. And these messaging that the industry is telling them that there is no alternative livelihood, and that this is the best kind of run for their money. And so we often see throughout tobacco control in general, the industry has these incredible messages all the time that convince us that what they're saying is true. And I think it is kind of the same in terms of the tobacco farming, is their messages. And some of these farmers in low and middle income countries are very desperate to bring in, you know, income to their families. They just believe what the industry says. And the industry is doing a fabulous job at that. And I think that what we need to do is the opposite, is find those economic arguments that prove what the industry is saying is incorrect, and prove that there are actual alternative livelihoods that produce more money and are less poisonous to our, you know, to our families. I might get into also, you know, the whole argument on what we could do in terms of 5.3, but perhaps I could save that for the next round of questions.
Thank you very much. Well, now our next speaker is from Zambia. It's Brenda Chitindley. Brenda is the founder and executive director of Tobacco Free Association of Zambia, TOFAZA, and president of the Zambian Tobacco Control Alliance. And she will talk about the méfaits de la culture du tabac de la Zambie. So, Brenda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. My only presentation is what I have experienced in the tobacco campaign in Zambia. I don't have a presentation, but what is on the ground right now in Zambia. Tobacco industry, like what Leslie has already mentioned, alluded, it's a heavy industry that definitely most of the government, most of the policymakers and government institutions are heavily indebted to the industry, because like the economic part, the economic situation that already Leslie has mentioned, that they contribute a lot of money to the government, and also the corporate social responsibility that they're giving to the communities, where they're protecting that a good company that can help the communities to raise their standard of living, while in actual fact, that's just a pretense for them to gain more money from the community or from the country that they're operating from. And they've come up with organizations similar to the tobacco control organizations. And mistakenly, most people who are not aware, they would think that they are helping, especially with the tobacco farmers. Like they have an organization, elimination of child labor, tobacco growing, which is contrary, very different from what Article 5.3 is the guidelines is indicating, because they just want to pretend to be seen that they're part of the government system, or the complying with the FCTC guideline 5.3 guidelines. And also they have a lot of they do a lot of blackmailing the tobacco farmers. You know, like tobacco farming is not all that helpful to the farmers. It's a sake of, they are just recycling poverty, because these tobacco farmers, tobacco industry, they give them a lot of loans, very high at very high price, and at the end of the result, they end up with nothing, completely nothing. The tobacco farmers. So the real blackmailers, they blackmail the tobacco farmers, they blackmail the policymakers that they're a good company that contributes to economic of the country, while they're not. And the other thing that we have come up with in Zambia is that the World Health Organization Zambian office and Ministry of Health and the Zambia Agriculture Research Institute under the Ministry of Agriculture, they've come up with a very good alternative livelihood program, which is supported by the donors. And I think this will change the whole situation in the tobacco farming in Zambia, because it's a very viable, very bright, they have very bright ideas to which the farmers have accepted. And we shall see that the tobacco industry in Zambia, I think it will go down. They won't be like the way they came in. Because of the farmers, that they understand now how tobacco industry are using them, and also on the harms of tobacco. They never knew that the tobacco farming is harmful, but through our awareness campaigns, they have now realized that tobacco is harmful. Hello, are people listening?
Yes.
Okay.
Are you done? Yes.
I think I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Just listening to you, a question came to my mind. Would you agree that the tobacco farmers are doubly exploited? They are exploited as workers, and they are also exploited politically.
Yes, Pascal, they're exploited political, they're exploited financially, they're exploited. You know, tobacco farming, we all know that it's a labor-intensive crop, that the tobacco farmers use sorts of labor to help them to make sure that they come up with a product. And also, again, the tobacco industry gives them a lot of loans to keep them so that they do not shift to other crops. And just like keeping them as their laborers, because they don't get anything out of tobacco production. they just work for the tobacco industry.
Thank you very much. This was a fascinating presentation. And now we have the next speaker is Inusa Sauna. Inusa is, I will switch to French. Inusa est le président de SOS Tabagisme Niger. Il est membre du conseil d'administration de l'Alliance pour le contrôle du tabac en Afrique, ACTA, et de l'Observatoire du tabac en Afrique francophone, OTAF. Il œuvre dans la lutte contre la propagation du tabagisme depuis plus de 20 ans et accessoirement, il a été préfet de grandes régions du Niger, dont l'une est 3 fois la surface, la grandeur de la Suisse. Inusa, la parole est à toi.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Bonjour Pascal. Je voudrais vraiment vous remercier de m'avoir associé à ce panel important pour parler de la question du tabac en lien notamment avec la population, notamment les conséquences immédiates sur la population. Alors donc, le premier point qu'on m'a demandé d'expliquer très brièvement, c'est l'action de fourberie qu'organisait l'industrie du tabac dans les années antérieures, parce qu'il faut souligner quand même depuis quelques années, les restrictions liées à l'évolution des législations dans nos pays ne permettaient plus ce genre d'action. Il s'agit en effet, au nom de la responsabilité sociale des entreprises, d'organiser des actions de relations publiques. Mais à chaque fois, on se rendra compte qu'ils ont un objectif caché, soit c'est une action qui visait à contrarier l'évolution d'une législation ou un engagement politique fort des gouvernements pour avoir des mesures restrictives donc, à la consommation du tabac. Et donc au Niger, nous avons eu un cas assez illustratif. J'ai eu le temps d'en parler, Pascal peut en témoigner, dans beaucoup de forats. Nous étions donc à quelques jours de l'adoption de la loi anti-tabac du Niger en 2006, si ma mémoire est bonne et fidèle. BAT organisait une opération de ce genre de don d'un forage d'addiction d'eau potable à une population qui n'en avait même pas besoin, dans un lieu non loin de la capitale. Mais le but était d'occuper médiatiquement l'espace en invitant toutes les grandes personnalités de la République, politiques, magistrats, parlementaires, tous. Et l'objectif était de faire bloquer donc le processus de cette législation. Et malheureusement, en son temps, ils ont pu avoir un succès, mais notre engagement fort a permis de faire revenir. Et ce que nous avons constaté, c'était quoi? C'est qu'en vérité, le château d'eau, c'est un mensonge. Nous avons laissé quelques semaines après, nous avons organisé une visite avec les médias et on s'est rendu compte, après la cérémonie, il n'y avait rien. Il n'y a ni d'eau, absolument rien du tout. C'est la rente médiatique qu'ils ont récoltée de manière spontanée et spécifique qui les intéresse. Donc voilà un peu toutes ces formes de fourberie, de cupidité dans lesquelles l'industrie du tabac peut se retrouver coupable. Alors, on m'a également demandé de parler de l'incidence de la consommation du tabac sur les ménages, sur notamment les ménages pauvres. Nous avons mené une étude il y a quelques années sur le lien entre le tabac et la pauvreté ici au Niger. Et cette étude a démontré de manière, en tout cas, assez claire, le lien étroit entre la consommation du tabac et la pauvreté. Et quand nous avons fait la promotion de ce rapport, ça a été un levier fort pour faire prendre conscience à beaucoup de gens sur l'incidence que cela pèse sur le budget de leur famille. Je vais vous donner un exemple. Chez nous, la majorité des gens qui fument, ce sont les pauvres. Ce sont les personnes qui vivent avec moins d'$1 par jour. Et si cette personne consacre la moitié, et pour certains 70% de leurs revenus à la consommation du tabac, vous vous rendez compte qu'il s'agit là d'un détournement qu'ils font de revenus familiales et qu'ils consacrent à la consommation du tabac. Ils réduisent la qualité de vie des enfants, ils n'ont pas d'économie, ils ne peuvent pas assurer l'éducation des enfants, ils ne peuvent pas assurer la santé des femmes et des enfants. Donc, c'est une conséquence énorme sur le ménage. Et plus tard, ils vont se retrouver avec des maladies que ni la famille, ni l'État ne peuvent prendre en charge et ils vont mourir inévitablement de manière précoce, laissant donc à la société des familles déjà appauvries et ça contribue à la multiplication de la pauvreté dans la plupart de nos pays africains. Aujourd'hui, je ne dirais pas que la situation a changé. Il n'y a pas une autre étude. Il y a eu des mesures qui sont ajoutées. Il y a eu vraiment beaucoup de progrès de 2006 à aujourd'hui. Mais il est évident, les pauvres continuent encore à souffrir donc de l'addiction, que ce soit des femmes ou des enfants, de l'addiction du chef de ménage qui est le mari, et toute la communauté naturellement prend un coup et les efforts des pays, les efforts des États ne pouvaient en aucun cas amoindrir ce choc, d'où la nécessité d'agir pour qu'on arrive à faire réduire la consommation du tabac. Tout à l'heure, Leslie l'a expliqué, eh bien, il y a un lien pour freiner l'atteinte des objectifs du développement durable tant que les populations les plus pauvres continuent à s'adonner à la consommation du tabac. Alors, Pascal, voilà brièvement ce que j'ai voulu dire en quelques mots sur ce sujet qu'on a bien voulu me demander donc de dire un mot.
Merci, Inoussa. On sent que c'est quelque chose que tu ressens et que tu as vécu de façon très proche. Est-ce que tu as le sentiment, et moi c'est un sentiment que j'ai, que c'est un problème d'égalité internationale. On a une population pauvre qui n'a certainement pas les moyens de se défendre contre ces grandes multinationales. Ces grandes multinationales génèrent des profits gigantesques qui partent ailleurs et très peu retournent dans ces pays pour lutter contre ce fléau. Et là, est-ce que tu as le sentiment qu'il y a un problème de financement qui n'est pas à la hauteur des enjeux?
Absolument, Pascal. Nous l'avons soulevé à son temps. C'est un combat inégal. Aujourd'hui, quand vous prenez dans la plupart de vos pays où les États sont assez riches, ils ont les moyens de résister parce qu'au moins, ils ont les moyens de soigner les malades. Quand vous avez des pays comme le mien, où tout est priorité pour les États, la question du tabac ne figure pas sur l'agenda de santé. Je crois que le budget que le gouvernement du Niger accorde au tabac, ça ne vaut même pas 2000 € par an. Et même ça, c'est récent. Et quand vous voyez aussi l'industrie dans son immensité et sa capacité à pouvoir maintenir ses profits, c'est naturellement un problème d'égalité. Et c'est pourquoi les pays qui en profitent le plus, c'est-à-dire les pays développés, doivent faire en sorte qu'il y ait beaucoup plus de moyens pour lutter contre le tabac dans les pays en voie de développement. Ce n'est que justice. Et ne pas le faire, c'est créer encore de manière supplémentaire un autre foyer d'inégalité humanitaire. Parce que c'est de ça qu'il s'agit. Nous avons ce sentiment nous l'avons toujours soutenu et il faut que les organisations de la société civile, mais surtout les organisations de la société civile dans les pays développés, puissent le faire porter au niveau des politiques de vos pays pour qu'ils comprennent qu'il faut soutenir nos États. Parce que c'est nos pays qui consomment le tabac. Ce sont nos populations qui en consomment et ils sont démunis car ils sont pauvres. Et c'est des sociétés qui sont ailleurs, qui enrichissent vos PIB, qui enrichissent vos banques et ils nous laissent ici avec la maladie et toutes les conséquences que vous imaginez.
Merci, merci. Écoute, je pense que c'est un message très important qu'il faut méditer, qu'il faut porter et qu'il faut continuer sans arrêt parce que c'est une injustice fondamentale et nous sommes tous conscients que c'est une injustice et on ne peut pas rester sans rien faire. On a quand même un message positif qui nous vient du Kenya, c'est le prochain orateur. C'est Dorcas Kiptui. Je vais parler en anglais. Dorcas is the head of the Division of Tobacco Control at the Ministry of Health of Kenya. She's a public health expert with a keen interest in international health policy, commercial determinants of health, and health promotion. Et Dorcas va nous parler de la situation au Kenya. Je lui laisse la parole. You have the floor.
Unfortunately, we don't have Dorcas with us at this moment. So I think we can just continue. We have some questions in the Q&A section, so we can continue with that.
I will check the questions. Has the problem with the English translation been fixed? This is a technical question.
The English channel interpreters, can you please confirm that you've worked on it? We have indicated to you that we have difficulties in the English channel. Can you confirm that this is sorted out, please? Very low. We can hear you, but it's not. You're not loud enough.
Okay.
Okay. So I think it's going to be better. Je pense que c'est bon, Pascal.
Okay. Now we have a question to Brenda, which is when tobacco farmers in Zambia are ready to exit tobacco, what do they prefer to switch to? What do they prefer to switch to? Subsistence farming or other cash crops? And which food or cash crop would they choose? Brenda.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, tobacco farmers are ready to switch on to other alternative livelihoods like what I indicated in the first place. And what the tobacco farmers are interested in right now is soybeans, maize, and the other cash crops like cotton, because the government right now has come up with a very, very high prices on these crops now. And by the next season, I think we have to see a lot of farmers shifting to maize growing, beans, rice, soybeans, and the other cash crops, which are very beneficial to them, to the community or to the population.
Thank you. We have another question from Lutgard, or it's a statement, maybe she can comment. The tobacco industry lures, bribes governments and political leaders to ensure that there are no market for alternative crops, thus frustrating farmers to sustain alternative livelihoods. Have you experienced this in your respective countries, or have you observed this? Who wants to answer this question? Or maybe Leslie.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, Pascal, and I agree. Also, Lutgard had mentioned too that the tobacco industry is the #1 barrier to implementation of Article 17. And I couldn't agree more. I think the tobacco industry is the #1 barrier to full implementation of all the articles, but definitely have a role to play in terms of Article 17. And I think that that was my point that I kind of paused on last time, Pascal, in the beginning when I said about 5.3. And ensuring that the tobacco industry is fully excluded from all policy and decision making within countries, and their tactics to kind of bribe and persuade governments, and governments kind of buy into that. And what we need to be doing as civil society and others is pushing and holding governments to account, to be respecting their and applying 5.3 measures, and applying those guidelines. And also, I think that, as civil society, we have a job to do in terms of working with the media and denouncing these different kind of, dirty tactics by the ministry, and by the governments as well that are accepting these bribes. And, we saw it a lot with COVID-19 as well, that the government was, that the industry was doing that as well in terms of providing, protection and ventilators and things like that. Now they're, bribing governments with money to not allow any kind of alternative livelihoods. So my kind of recommendation there is, obviously I would say I fully agree with Lutgard that that's happening, and I obviously can't speak to any experiences in my country about that, but just saying that I think us as civil society have a huge role to do in denouncing the industry and making noise about it, and also denouncing these, having concrete examples of what we're seeing the industry do and the governments that are kind of accepting this type of behavior and bribes from the tobacco industry.
Thank you.
Well, just to come in, Pastor.
Sorry. Okay, please go ahead.
Yes, and the ministries that have been persuaded by the tobacco industry are Ministry of Agriculture, Commerce, Trade and Industry. These ministries definitely they line up with the tobacco industry. For example, like in Zambia, the industry have come up with a tobacco act benefiting the tobacco industry, benefiting the growing sales of tobacco, and it was officiated by the Minister of Agriculture. So these are tobacco industry's tactics, but as civil society, we have exposed them a lot. And this time, we don't know what tricks they are using now, but we shall keep on exposing them until they stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Daniel Oba, République du Congo. Existe-t-il en Afrique quelques pays qui ont des politiques de substitution de culture du tabac par des cultures non polluantes? Sinon, comment faire pour amener nos gouvernements à adopter de telles politiques et stratégies? Ça recouvre un petit peu ce que Leslie a traité dans son exposé. Est-ce que quelqu'un veut ajouter quelque chose? On passe à la question suivante. Alain Kabinda from Zambia, Daily News. I think the media is also the key in fighting this. My question for Mrs. Brenda Chitenda is, what are civil society doing to make that tobacco bill is being enacted first? Brenda.
Thank you very much. On the tobacco control bill, we have conducted a lot of advocacy work, and we are very positive that once the parliament opens, it will go to Parliament. It is at an advanced stage now, and we are very hopeful that it will be enacted. Okay, with the help of media, they've done a lot of work for us, and we just thank media because they're always on us on tobacco control advocacy. They always ask us to submit the articles, and almost every month, every week, we publicize and we expose tobacco industry activities. Media in Zambia has done a very great work for us.
Thank you. Now, another question from Sonia from Ashbourne. How do you see the role of the Philip Morris funded Foundation for a Smoke-Free World concerning implementation of Article 17? Is the foundation also present in Zambia as it is in Malawi? I'm sorry, Brenda, but this is again addressed to you.
Very much. Of now, it has been silenced. Possibly, I cannot rule out that it's not in Zambia. It might be Zambia by doing silent work because of the exposure that we have conducted in Zambia. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Finally, it's a contribution on Zambia. The farmers are excited to switch to other crops, and right now others have already switched, as WHO is yet to kick off the Alternative Livelihood Project in the eastern part of Zambia, which will spread to all the tobacco growing areas. So this is a contribution, a positive one, and thank you from the Paxina peer who made it. Now, I think it seems to me, if I may comment, is that behind all of this lurks an issue of international equity and international justice. And it seems that in this equation, the rich countries are not fully aware or realizing their responsibility, and they are certainly not assuming it. When I've studied Africa a lot. Africa is a continent with a huge potential. It's a continent which is actually huge. You know, you can put China, the United States, many European countries inside the territory of Africa, and you will still have free land. So it's a big country. It's a young country. Most of the population is young. It's a developing, growing country economically. And it's a country which has an enormous capacity, an enormous potential. And it would be terrible that this potential is wasted, distracted by things like tobacco consumption. And I think this is dramatic that the tobacco companies see this huge potential only to put money in the deep pockets of those who are already too rich and they don't know what to do with their money. So, I mean, this is a problem of international justice and international equity. Okay, this is, and therefore I think we should conclude with the WHO motto: we should not grow tobacco, we should grow food and use this precious land not for a product which is toxic from all point of view, socially toxic, toxic for the land, toxic for the people, toxic for our health, and toxic for our minds because it leads to corruption. So Do you take this as a conclusion of this meeting, or maybe the organizers might wish to say something else?
Merci à tous. Peut-être de donner la parole du coup à Léonce pour qu'il y ait la présentation de la campagne d'ATCA associée à la Journée mondiale sans tabac. Et encore un grand merci à tous les panélistes pour leur intervention.
Léonce, the floor is yours.
Bonjour et bonsoir à tous. Je voudrais juste vous dire un grand merci pour les échanges sur cette thématique, sur ce thème de la Journée mondiale sans tabac, et pour permettre aux uns et aux autres de pouvoir mobiliser la documentation. Et nous avons mis sur une page sur notre site web. Cette documentation est rendue disponible et je vais mettre le lien dans le chat ici pour que chacun puisse visiter et tirer l'essentiel. Déjà sur la page d'accueil du site de ATCA, les gens peuvent, tout le monde peut voir déjà un casier qui est là, qui permet d'accéder aux informations. Je voudrais dire que nous avons, dans ce sens, comme chaque année, fait une campagne pour l'Afrique et une campagne régionale que nous avons nommée « Nourrir l'Afrique et non l'industrie ». Et donc, un logo est développé et vous pouvez visiter. Voilà la page. J'ai mis le lien dans le chat aussi pour que les uns et les autres puissent aller visiter et tirer l'essentiel comme documentation ou information. Et donc, le logo, c'est Nourrir l'Afrique et non l'industrie du tabac, Feed Africa, not Big Tobacco. Et je vous remercie. Voilà l'information que je voudrais partager avec vous. À très bientôt. Merci à toi. Et Pascal, à toi.
Eh bien, merci. Écoutez, nous arrivons au terme de cette présentation. J'aimerais remercier tous les intervenants, les organisateurs, et je pense que nous avons beaucoup appris et que nous repartons avec une motivation encore accrue pour lutter contre cette industrie, pour remplacer cette culture toxique par de la culture qui permet de nourrir les gens et d'aller dans le sens du développement durable. Merci beaucoup et au revoir à tout le monde et bonne fin de journée.